Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses, and this is Kiblah and Mihrab by Frank A. King. An article taken from Rosicrucian Digest, Volume 34, Number 7, July 1956. Kiblah and Mihrab by Frank A. King. Readers often wonder about the devotional pilgrimage of the Islamic world to Mecca. An understanding of the terms Kiblah and Mihrab, in addition to historical facts in the time of Muhammad, founder of the Islamic religion, can prove enlightening. Upon entering a mosque, the first impression, for most strangers, is the feeling of vastness yet emptiness which it gives. It seems to be a wide space walled round and roofed over by a lofty dome. The fundamental theme is the Tartar or Bedouin tent. It has very little detail of architecture, with apparently no central point toward which the lines of the structure converge to explain its purpose. An inconspicuous pulpit is in one corner. Eventually, the visitor appreciates that the mosque has a focus of interest, a kind of alcove or niche in the wall, which is sometimes richly decorated and made conspicuous by its form or material. But often it is very plain. This niche is called the Mihrab, and is intended to mark the direction in which lies Mecca, the sacred city of the followers of the Prophet Muhammad, and that direction is called the Kiblah or Kebla. Brewer, in his Dictionary of Phrase and Fable, traces the meaning of Kaaba from Arabic Kaaba, a square house. He states, "A shrine of Mecca, said to have been built by Ismail and Abraham on the spot where Adam first worshipped after his expulsion from paradise, and where, after being a wanderer on the face of the earth for 200 years, he received pardon. In the northeast corner is the famous black stone. The famous black stone is an irregular oval about 7 inches in breadth and is surrounded with a circle of gold. The legend is that when Abraham wished to build the Kaaba, the stones came to him of their own accord, and the patriarch commanded. Ibn Abbas reports that the Prophet said that when the stone came from paradise, it was whiter than milk, and that it has become black through the sins of the millions who have kissed it. On the day of resurrection, it is to have 2 eyes by which it will recognize all those who have kissed it, and a tongue with which it will bear witness to Allah." Woodford, in Kenning's Cyclopedia of Freemasonry, says under the heading of Kaaba or Kaaba, "As Mackay well puts it, the name of the holy temple at Mecca is to the Mohammedans what the Temple of Solomon was to the Jews." Some writers, however, seem to think that the Kaaba or Kaaba is more properly the name of the black stone of the Kaaba. The building is built in a cubical form, 15 feet long, 15 feet wide, and 15 feet high. It has but one opening or door at the east. It is said to be somehow connected with Oriental Hermeticism, but we doubt the fact very much. It is of modern date and construction. Every worshipper kneels on the carpeted floor of the mosque and faces the mihrab, for in so doing he is sure to be looking to the right quarter where his prayer will be heard. One might say that the mihrab is the mariner's compass of the sanctuary, and it varies, of course, in different countries. The Qibla point, or the direction in which Mecca lies, is the south in Syria and Palestine, the east in Egypt, and the southeast in Constantinople. The celebrated Mosque of Omar in Jerusalem, the holiest sanctuary after Mecca, has 4 doors which face the cardinal points, but it has no mihrab, for it is not a true mosque. It is never used for prayer or worship. It is the magnificent covering of the rude, rocky top of Mount Moriah, the foundation stone of Solomon's temple, and from that circumstance is called the Dome of the Rock. It is merely a station in the outer court of the true Aqsa Mosque near at hand. In this Aqsa Mosque, the pillars on either side of the mihrab form 2 pairs very near to each other, so that it is difficult for a person to squeeze his body through between the pillars. Pilgrims used to attempt this feat in the hope of thereby securing an easier admission into heaven, so the sides of the pillars became worn by the constant friction. However, after a tragedy several decades ago, the Pasha of Jerusalem ended the practice by setting an iron stanchion between each pair of pillars. This ordinance of mihrab was not the inspiration of Muhammad. It dates to the primitive Asiatic sun worship. The region of the rising sun was the source of life and light, of warmth, hope, and joy, and therefore it was regarded as the home of deity. The religious ceremonies were performed by the worshipper looking towards that quarter. In Egypt, Assyria, and Greece, solar temples were so constructed with the doors open to the east. As the sun rose, the first rays shining right through the doorway into the inmost sanctuary were reflected by a golden disk and thus illuminated the whole place. The priest waited until this cloud of glory filled the shrine before he began the appointed rites of chant, incense, and prayer. The mihrab of the mosque is a relic or survival of this worship. Muhammad wisely adopted all that was best in the old natural religion of Arabia and adapted it to his own new doctrine. Facing west. Sun worship was an abomination to the Hebrews. Therefore, the arrangements both in the tabernacle and the temple were such as to cause the worshippers to face not east but west. This was the custom of the Jews in the synagogue when the temple disappeared after the destruction of Jerusalem. By facing in an opposite direction from that of the heathen sun worshippers, they attested their abhorrence of that religion. In his vision, Ezekiel, with horror-stricken eyes, saw a number of worshippers standing at the door of the temple of God, between the porch and the altar, with their faces towards the east, worshipping the rising sun in that quarter. This attitude implied that they had turned their backs upon the temple and its worship, that they had forsaken the living and true God, and had adopted the idolatries of the heathen. The ancient custom of the mihrab was transmitted into Christianity. The influence of the old sun worship still acts diamagnetically to adjust the axis of the church and turn the body of the worshipper. Everyone who is conversant with religious architecture and ritual knows about the orientation of churches, or the placing of the sanctuary, or part containing the altar towards the east. All the early Christian churches used to end in an apse which pointed in the direction of the rising sun. These had entrances in the west end, so that those who passed within had their backs towards the region of the sunset, or darkness and death, and their faces towards the altar in the east, from where came light and life and happiness. Also in the early Christian church, it was believed that by praying towards the east, the soul was seeking and longing for its old home in paradise, to which it hoped to be restored by Jesus Christ, the second Adam. The Son of Man, as he himself said, would come again on the last day. As lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so in prayer the early Christian worshippers were looking for and awaiting their Lord's return. Daniel. The position which Daniel assumed in Babylon when engaged in the private worship of the God of Israel had a double significance. His windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed. Daniel chapter 6 verse 10. His action was a protest against the prevailing idolatry of Babylon and a proof of his ardent love of his native land. Many of his countrymen had yielded to the evil seductions of the luxurious life around them. They married heathen women and lost their Jewish pedigree. They forgot their sacred city and settled down contentedly in the land of their captivity. But Daniel was too noble and too patriotic to follow their example. In the midst of the universal idolatry, he clung even closer to the pure faith of his forefathers. In spite of the magnificence around him, he thought all the more sadly of the desolation of Jerusalem. Amid the varied cosmopolitan society of the capital of the world then, fusing all races into one, he preserved all the more faithfully his national exclusiveness. Daniel was one of the true-hearted Jews who wept whenever they remembered Zion and could not sing the Lord's song in a strange land for the heartbreak in their voices. Therefore, when performing his daily acts of devotion, he chose in his abode a room with a window looking to the west, thus not only turning his back upon the worship of the sun, which the people of Babylon practiced, but also facing Jerusalem, the center of his faith and the goal of his hopes. The reigning monarch was considered to be an incarnation of the sun god, and divine honors were paid to him. For Daniel, as a representative Jew at the royal court, such prayer was impossible. So in prayer he turned his face away from the region sacred to the idolatrous God whom the nation worshipped. He looked where the living and true God had set his glory and declared his name. With the windows of his palace wide open, every person passing along could see him kneeling in his room. Daniel did not leave the usual place of prayer for the Jew and seek some more retired spot in consequence of the king's command. And he did not place himself conspicuously before the eyes of the public and so secure observation in order to defy the edict. Calmly and meekly, without ostentation or concealment, without any self-consciousness, he continued to do what he had been accustomed to do. He made no change in his daily habits, no change as to the law of his God. Daniel acted with the utmost simplicity and naturalness, in the manner of all Eastern people who perform devotions in public and place their prayer carpet wherever they happen to be. Far from the sanctuary of his God and the sacred objects of Jewish worship, Daniel had recourse to spiritual communion with heaven, although no oblation of burnt offering for Jehovah was possible in the land of his exile. But the universal presence of Jehovah was realized all the more vividly in the absence of local symbols, and the practice and the sense of eternal things became more definite and appreciable in the loss of earthly ceremonial. With his face towards Jerusalem and all the yearnings of an exiled heart, there can be little doubt as the substance and purpose of Daniel's prayers. He felt the times were dark and evil, and that the fortunes of God's heritage had sunk to the lowest point. The Holy Land was laid waste. The holy city was a desolation. The temple of God was in ruins. The people of the covenant were captives among heathens. But no matter how much Daniel might grieve over the destruction of the holy city, he never despaired of its ultimate triumph. He could look beyond the gloom of the immediate present. The captivity would end, and the exiles would return home. The Holy Land would be repeopled, and the temple would be raised from its ashes to witness again for the pure faith of Israel. Therefore Daniel prayed earnestly with his face to the west, confident that the evening star of his country's temporary decadence would become the morning star of his nation's glory. That out of the sunset and the darkness would come the dawn of a better day for the world. Such was the significance of the Kiblah of Daniel. The Mihrab, or praying place of his chamber, was a different quarter from that of the rest of the world. He looked westward. To his neighbors, the west was the region of death and darkness. They looked east for life and light. To Daniel, salvation was not to come from the sunrise, but from the sunset. And after the dark national calamities that were to endure for a night, with the morning would come joy, when the discipline of the darkness would have purified Jehovah's people for the light. The prayer of Daniel was very much like the prayer of Peter in similar circumstances when the apostle stood on the top of the house of Simon the tanner beside the sea. The view behind him was circumscribed by the high land on which the town was built. Jerusalem was completely out of sight. No part of Judea could be seen. The eastern horizon, with its completed history, its exclusive law and religion, closed behind him. But before Peter expanded an endless prospect over the western waters, the horizon of Christianity, of the worldwide, time-long faith and kingdom of the Son of Man. The Mihrab of Peter pointed still farther west than that of Daniel, away towards the setting sun, where the Levant Islands, famous in ancient story, were the stepping stones of the gospel in its first giant strides from its cradle to its great field of manly enterprise and opportunity. Greece, Rome and Spain, the realms of Europe, destined later to be the scenes of its momentous conquests. Daniel was removed to Babylon and Peter to the seaside of Joppa in order that, separated from all the rites and sacrifices of a localized ceremonial law, their worship might be free and worldwide. There was to be no Kiblah or Mihrab, no Gerizim or Jerusalem, but everywhere God was to be worshipped in spirit and truth. His spiritual worship in future was not to have any local habitation or fixed form. Everywhere the effectual prayer of the righteous was to ascend to heaven like incense, and the lifting up of the hands as the evening sacrifice. Through the absence of ritual and the loss of sacrifice was to come a deeper recognition of the power of personal prayer wherever offered. When Solomon finished his magnificent temple in his dedicatory prayer, he asked from Jehovah as a special favor that every suppliant, no matter where he might be or however he might be situated, if he turned his face to the sanctuary of God, might have his petition granted. Therefore, every Hebrew was accustomed to turn his face to God's holy place when engaged in prayer, and expected a special blessing to come to him from that region. To the Mahometan, his Qibla is not a superstition but a solemn reality, and his prayer is addressed to a living personal being and has all the earnestness of conviction and sincerity. His Qibla is the outward object for the expression of the deepest longing of his soul, and therefore his prayer, as he turns his face to Mecca when uttering it, has more of the nature of true prayer in it than a mere form without meaning or purpose. Muhammad. It was not before the 6th century that Arabia became particularly remarkable in the history of the world. The wild Arabs, as they have been called generally, had already signalized themselves by invading the empire of the East when Muhammad was born, either in 569 or 570 AD at Mecca, the principal city of their country. Muhammad is said to have been descended from some great families, but it is certain that his immediate progenitors were poor, and he had little education except what his own means and mind could give him. Yet he became the founder of a great empire and the creator of a religion which may have affected greater numbers of mankind than Christianity itself. Some writers have attributed the success of Muhammad to certain indulgences allowed in the Quran. But these indulgences existed before. This extraordinary work inculcates elevated notions of the divine nature and of moral duties. It taught that God's will and power were constantly exerted towards the happiness of his creatures, and that the duty of man was to love his neighbors, assist the poor, protect the injured, to be humane to inferior animals, and to pray 7 times a day. The Quran taught that to revive the impression of those laws which God had engraved originally in the hearts of men, he had sent his prophets upon earth, Abraham, Moses, Jesus Christ, and Muhammad, the last, the greatest, to whom all the world should owe its conversion to the true religion. At first, Muhammad's doctrines were violently opposed by his fellow citizens of Mecca, and the Prophet, in 622 AD, was compelled to flee from the city to save his life. He took refuge in the city of Medina, and with the help of his disciples, he soon was able to return to Mecca at the head of an armed force. In 627, Muhammad was saluted as King of Arabia and Syria. He died suddenly in 632. Abu Bakr, his father-in-law and successor, published the books of the Quran and continued and extended the empire which Muhammad had left him. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.